Many people, after reading Phoebe's kit, realize that she is going to have many problems. But so many people don't fully understand the extent of just how bad it is, because Phoebe's kit is confused with itself. It doesn't know what it's trying to do, but most people can't pick up on that. So I've decided to make a video on Phoebe's fundamental flaws that hold her back from being a good character. First of all, we have to dissect just what is so wrong with Phoebe's kit. And to do that, you have to understand kind of what her deal is. So I'm not going to be explaining her full kit here, but I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version of what's important for this video. So Phoebe is a hybrid character between a main DPS and a sub DPS character, who wants to deal Spectro damage when enemies are inflicted with Spectro Frazzle. She has two modes to accomplish this. There is the Absolution and the Confession. Absolution is the DPS mode, where all of her abilities that do relevant damage get large damage boosts when the enemy is inflicted with Spectro Frazzle. And then there's the sub DPS mode called Confession. This one is going to have a shorter field time, and it's essentially based around Phoebe applying an absolute crap load of Spectro Frazzle, and when she's done, she swaps out, which will enhance the team's Spectro Frazzle damage. And if you were paying close attention to that, you can probably already decipher the first problem with Phoebe's kit. Phoebe wants to deal damage with Spectro Frazzle. However, in her on-field mode, she doesn't actually have any way of applying it outside of her intro skill, which gives only one pathetic stack. Now, what I need you to understand is that without Phoebe's outro skill enhancement in the Confession mode, the stacks for Spectro Frazzle only last 3 seconds each, which means that for an entire Phoebe rotation, her own Spectro Frazzle application is unable to keep up with her damage output and her field time. This is incredibly damning for a character, because so many of her damage buffs are based around having that Spectro Frazzle on enemies. Phoebe gives herself an incredible amount of buffs because she has to make up for her low multipliers. But what happens when you're unable to get those buffs? You become entirely cooked. And because we don't have a lot of characters who are able to apply Spectro Frazzle in the current roster, Phoebe's team options become incredibly limited because of this. Because Zani is not yet released, who is most likely going to be an additional Spectro Frazzle character, Phoebe is essentially going to be locked into teams with Spectro Rover. It's going to not even be a choice. You have to run the Spectro Rover, because almost all of Phoebe's mechanics entirely rely on Spectro Frazzle being present on the enemy, which Phoebe can't keep up with herself. So one of her team slots is already taken by a character who has a low amount of buffing and an okay amount of damage. But you know what? Maybe that's fine. Having one team slot taken by one specific character, we can deal with that, right? We can use a second character, right? You know, to buff Phoebe in a good way? Well, unfortunately, no. Phoebe gives herself so many stats within her own kits to make up for her low multipliers that any additional stat buffing is going to feel like a ginormous waste. Oh my god, you just can't get anything right with her, can you? Let's think about outro skills for a second. Outro skills are the primary way to buff characters in the current Wuthering Waves version, and they give a stat that is called damage amplification. This is something that is separate from damage bonus, which is something a lot of people get wrong. Damage amplification is its own stat that is applied at the very end of the damage formula, which is what makes it so powerful. But much like any stat, it can be a victim of diminishing returns. What that means is if you have too much of a certain stat, getting more of it is just going to be less value than getting a different type of stat. And one of the reasons that damage amplification is such a powerful stat right now is because it's only really seen in outro skills to buff other characters. However, Phoebe decided to spit on this idea and give herself 160%. Compare this to the average 4-star buffer. The average 4-star buffer gives 38%. So Phoebe gives more than 4 times the amount of damage amplification than a Mortefi does for her own heavy attacks. This means that Mortefi's outro skill is just going to be a drop in the bucket. What is that going to mean? 38% when compared to 160% is nothing, which means that Mortefi is incredibly wasted. This also ties back into the fact that so much of her damage is differing around multiple damage types. Liberation, Outro, Basic, and Heavy attacks all have a very large portion within Phoebe's damage, which means that there's not one specific type of attack that you want to buff with Phoebe. The only thing I can think of is Spectro damage, but there's not a single character in the game right now who can actually give Spectro damage amplification. And Zani is not an excuse. We are not going to be future impacting for this, because Kuro has already shown us that they are perfectly capable of making every character in their game self-sufficient. The only exception for this is Jinshi, but what she needs is coordinated attacks, something that there is plenty of characters who can trigger that for her. But Phoebe just doesn't have anything right now. She can't even properly benefit from things like Shorekeeper's crit buffing, because she already overcaps on crit rate because of her own weapon, and then the Spectro Frazzle set giving an additional 20% crit rate. So if you run her on her signature, those crit buffs, half of it's going to waste. Even damage bonus is something that Phoebe has in abundance, getting almost as much as Jinshi, and Jinshi already wants to run an attack free cost. So Phoebe is already close enough to that point where she just prefers attack over damage bonus. And I think ultimately, a majority of these problems are caused by one singular fact. Kuro Games is scared of making a character that has two roles and performs well in both of them. Phoebe is not only a main DPS, she is also a sub DPS for Spectro Frazzle. But we can't currently use this mode, because Spectro Frazzle's damage is not high enough to make it worth using. However, this doesn't mean that her DPS mode should be punished because she can also be a sub DPS. And I think that's ultimately the issue. They were too scared of making her DPS good, so they had to make her multipliers low so that her sub DPS mode could not be overpowered. But because their multipliers were low, they had to buff them within her kit, leaving it so she cannot be buffed in any efficient way right now, which just left the hypercarry playstyle to be kinda bad. The best hypercarry setup right now is using Mortefi and Spectro Rover on the Rejuvenating Glow set. Spectro Rover is not the issue in this team for me. I think Spectro Rover is fine. I think it's actually kind of nice that we don't have to use Verena or Shorekeeper with one of our characters. I think that's a good idea. However, Spectro Rover doesn't have enough buffing in their own kit. So you need that second slot, aka Mortefi in this case, to give a good amount of buffing. But I've already explained why his outro skill becomes kind of a waste in the grand scheme of things. So you end up not being able to buff Phoebe as much as you should be able to, which just means her hypercarry playstyle falls behind. Kuro Games is implementing half measures for their two playstyles. To give a bit of an analogy, it's like, what if Kuro Games wanted each character to be their own separate pie, but Phoebe is two half pies in one, so you get one full pie technically, but they say you can only eat one of these pie halves at the same time, so you can't have a full pie. That made no sense, but I hope you understand the analogy here. They were too scared of giving us a good DPS, so they gave us a mid DPS and a mid sub DPS. And because we can only use one at a time, it just means that Phoebe ends up being lackluster. And this is not helped by the fact that Spectro Frazzle's damage is just kind of awful. I could have excused the fact that Phoebe is very hard to buff if Spectro Frazzle was a larger part of her damage contribution, but it's not. In the current version of the beta, in a hypercarry Phoebe team, Spectro Frazzle can barely even outdamage Shorekeeper, who is supposed to be a healer with only okay damage. Spectro Frazzle just doesn't have good damage, so we're entirely relying on Phoebe's damage, but because Phoebe's damage can't be increased through buffers, she's just left hanging. This leads to Phoebe's best team setups right now being dual carry teams with characters like Changli or Sheng Liao, which is very clearly not Kuro Games' intention. But I can't be here talking all this smack without even presenting a single solution for Phoebe, right? Well, I'm gonna be here to present a solution. First of all, her reliance on Spectro Frazzle being applied to the enemy. I don't think this is the biggest issue within her kit, but it definitely is something that restricts her team building. So she needs to be able to apply more within her own kit, even in DPS mode. And there is a multitude of ways to make this handled correctly. First of all, you could try making it so her Forte Heavy Attack is able to apply Shimmer to enemies. Shimmer is the debuff that Spectro Rover has, where Spectro Frazzle will no longer tick down once it deals damage, for a certain amount of time. This will help Phoebe's singular stack of Spectro Frazzle that she applies have a longer uptime, and Spectro Rover would still have a use case in triggering the second part of the Eternal Radiance's 5-piece. You could also allow her to stack Spectro Frazzle on enemies in DPS mode, but greatly reduces damage. I'm thinking maybe one stack per enhanced basic attack, and then make it so while Phoebe is in her Absolution state, Spectro Frazzle damage is reduced by 90%. This is, of course, a pretty lazy way to do it, but it would allow Phoebe to access her entire kit without needing Spectro Rover, and it would also keep the Spectro Frazzle damage to be balanced. And then additionally, if you want something even more boring, you could just make it so her intro skill applies 5 stacks of Spectro Frazzle instead of 1. This would give us a 15-second duration, which should be enough for an on-field Phoebe to do her entire job. To fix the issue of Phoebe being very hard to buff right now, I think we need to start focusing in on one specific damage type, and I'm going to choose for heavy attacks, because the last time we saw a heavy attack DPS was GN. I think first of all, we would have to change the damage amplification buff within Phoebe's kit to a multiplier buff. This would make it so Mortefi's buff is not entirely lost in the sauce, and it would overall just make him better for Phoebe. Additionally, we can change it so her basic attacks deal heavy attack damage instead. This would mean she's able to proc Mortefi's damage more, because he deals 2 coordinate attacks when heavy attack damage is dealt, instead of 1. This would be a big help not only towards Mortefi's damage, but it would also make Mortefi's buff more effective. Changing her damage amplification buff would also help with her stat saturation, because that way outro skills would be able to buff Phoebe a lot more effectively. Crit and damage percent are in an okay state right now. It's mainly damage amplification that's an issue right now. And then, for Spectro Frazzle damage, if you really wanted Spectro Frazzle to do a lot of damage, we'd need to entirely abandon the idea of making Phoebe do talent damage. So what we could do is nerf her multipliers by a ridiculous amount, but instead give her a passive that allows her Spectro Frazzles to crit based on her own crit rate and crit damage. It would make Eternal Radiance still a good set on Phoebe, while also making it so that she is more reliant on Spectro Frazzle's damage, and gives the effect more of a purpose other than just, I am here to serve as a stack counter for Phoebe's self-buffs. This could be an effect that applies for both Absolution and Confession, because Confession is all about buffing that Spectro Frazzle, so just making Spectro Frazzle even stronger is something that the Confession state would be fine with. All we'd have to do is make it so Absolution has even stronger Spectro Frazzle buffs. But what do you think of Phoebe's kit right now? Do you think her kit is good, or do you think she's lackluster? I'd love to hear your opinions down in the comments below. If you learned something new from this video, be sure to let me know in the comments below. Also like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any further questions, you can join my Discord, in which I am very active. You can also follow me on Twitter if you just want my random thoughts on things. But that'll be it from me. Peace.